principio me voy conforme, teniendo en cuenta que en las Naciones Unidas los países democráticos son una minoría. En ese sentido, en el diálogo interactivo, las recomendaciones que le formularon a Cuba los países que uno esperaría que le hagan recomendaciones comprometidas con los derechos humanos, lo han hecho, fundamentalmente sobre todas las carencias que hay en materia de libertades fundamentales en Cuba, libertad de asociación, expresión, reunión, participación política, y hasta hubo algunos duros cuestionamientos, como de Alemania y el Reino Unido, porque no se les permitió a activistas democráticos cubanos estar presentes aquí. Esas recomendaciones ya el canciller cubano adelantó que las iba a rechazar, que son, como siempre, rechaza las recomendaciones que le señalan a Cuba los cuestionamientos más graves.
President, Germany condemns all reprisals of Cuba against human rights defenders, including against individuals linked to this UPR. Germany recommends 1. Ratify without delay the ICCPR and the ICESCR. 2. Fully cooperate with human rights mechanisms and grant them unhindered access to Cuba, including to government officials, civil society organizations and human rights defenders, to prisons and detention centers. 3. Review all legal provisions, including Article 62 of the Constitution, which unduly restricts the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, to bring them in line with international laws and standards. 4. Immediately stop arbitrary detention, imprisonment and harassment of activists who peacefully exercise their rights to freedom of expression, association or peaceful assembly. Thank you, Mr. President.
We are deeply concerned at reports of human rights defenders being prevented from travelling to Geneva for the UPR and have 3 recommendations. 1. End measures to restrict freedom of expression and assembly, including short-term detentions and the use of broad criminal charges such as dangerousness. 2. Criminalise all forms of human trafficking in line with the Palermo Protocols and address reportedly coercive elements of Cuban labour practices and foreign medical missions. 3. Ensure the right to a fair trial and improve prison conditions through ratification of the ICCPR, adherence to the UN Basic Principles on the independence of the judiciary and the role of lawyers, and the standard minimum rules on the treatment of prisoners. We encourage Cuba to consider how promoting human rights is compatible with the principle of national unity. Thank you.
Président, je remercie la délégation de Cuba pour la présentation de son rapport. La France adresse les recommandations suivantes à Cuba. Ratifier le pacte international relatif aux droits civils et politiques, le pacte international relatif aux droits économiques, sociaux et culturels, le protocole facultatif se rapportant à la Convention des Nations Unies contre la torture et autres peines et traitements cruels, inhumains ou dégradants, ainsi que le statut de Rome sur la Cour pénale internationale. Abolir la peine de mort en droit, transposer en droit interne la Convention relative à la torture et autres peines et traitements cruels, inhumains ou dégradants, garantir la liberté d'expression, de manifestation et de réunion, et mettre fin au harcèlement, à l'intimidation, aux persécutions et au placement arbitraire en détention des militants des droits de l'homme, des journalistes et des opposants. Mettre en place une institution nationale de défense des droits de l'homme qui soit conforme aux principes de Paris.
Ireland warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks it for its presentation today. Ireland welcomes the recent visit of the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, and we encourage Cuba to continue to cooperate with Special Procedures mandate holders. Ireland is extremely concerned about the reports of intimidation and reprisals against human rights defenders, including those who sought to engage with this UPR cycle. Ireland recommends that Cuba ensure that civil society members, HRDs and journalists can operate free from hindrance and insecurity, including by repealing legislation relating to so-called pre-criminal social dangerousness. We remain concerned about issues relating to detention and access to justice for detainees. Ireland recommends that Cuba guarantee that all detainees have access to a lawyer of their choice from the outset of the deprivation of liberty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the delegation of Cuba and we appreciate efforts Cuba has made since last UPR cycle, especially in preventing and combating human trafficking. In a constructive spirit, Italy offers the following recommendations. 1. Ratify the ICCPR and the ICESCR. 2. Maintain the moratorium on executions and consider moving towards abolition of death penalty. 3. take concrete measures to promote the fair justice principles consistent with international standards, especially by reviewing the legislation and implementation of pre-trial detention. And 4, guarantee freedom of opinion and expression online and offline, including dissenting political opinions, and safeguard the activity of human rights defenders and journalists.
Estonia welcomes Cuba to its third UPR. Estonia acknowledges that the human rights priorities of the government mentioned in its report to promote the strengthening of its democracy and people's participation in electoral processes and decision-making. We are concerned about reports of reprisals of Cuban human rights defendants, including in connection with the current review process. Estonia recommends Cuba to ratify the ICCPR and both of its optional protocols, ratify the OPCAT, ensure everyone's right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and to freedom of movement, including for civil society representatives, journalists and human rights defenders. Adopt the freedom of information law in accordance with international standards, decriminalize defamation and include it in civil code in accordance with international standards. We wish the delegation of Cuba a successful review. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finland thanks Cuba for its national report. Finland will wish to hear about the measures Cuba is taking to amend its national legislation in accordance with the ICCPR and the ICESCR. Finland wishes to make the following 2 recommendations. First, Finland recommends Cuba to ratify without delay the ICCPR and the ICESCR. Second, Finland recommends Cuba to extend invitations to the UN Special Rapporteurs on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, on the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, and on the situation of human rights defenders. We regret the reports that civil society representatives were prevented from participating in the UPR pre-session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Latvia thanks Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba for his presentation and recommends to the government of Cuba, first, to ratify Rome Statutes of International Criminal Court and fully align national legislation with all obligations under the Rome Statutes. Second, to respond positively to pending visit requests by the special procedure mandate holders of the Human Rights Council and consider the extension of a standing invitation to all mandate holders. And third, to end measures restricting rights of freedom of expression and to peaceful assembly and association, including short-term detention of political opponents, human rights activists and members of civil society organizations, as well as intimidation and arrests of journalists. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. Lithuania welcomes the high-level Cuban delegation to the third UPR cycle. Lithuania remains concerned about Cuba's human rights record and urges Cuba to intensify the efforts towards significantly improving it. We recommend, first, to enable and promote the work of civil society by discontinuing restrictive laws and practices. Second, to end arbitrary detention and harassment of human rights defenders as well as media workers. Third, to enable independent human rights monitoring at all detention sites. Fourth, to guarantee freedom of peaceful assembly and association for all citizens in accordance with international standards. And fifth, to ratify the ICCPR and its second optional protocol. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands thanks Cuba for its report. We welcome the frank and open dialogue on human rights, both bilaterally and within the framework of the EU-Cuba Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement. We call on Cuba to protect all persons who are targets of intimidation or violence, in particular LGBTI persons. We recommend Cuba to 1. Act in accordance with and ratify the already signed ICCPR and ICESCR without restrictions to freedom of expression, freedom of press or freedom of assembly, and incorporate them into its national legislation. 2. Take measures to put an end to arbitrary detentions by ensuring that persons under arrest have immediate access to a defense counsel and are promptly brought before an independent judge for a hearing. We wish Cuba all the success with its UPR. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. New Zealand recommends that the Government of the Republic of Cuba review all legal provisions which restrict the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association to ensure compliance with international human rights law and standards. New Zealand recommends the immediate and unconditional release of all prisoners of conscience who have been imprisoned solely for the peaceful exercise of their rights to freedom of expression, association or peaceful assembly. New Zealand recommends that Cuba continues to remove unlawful limitations on the right to access information and on the freedom of opinion and expression under international human rights law. While noting that it has not been applied since 2003, New Zealand recommends that Cuba abolish the death penalty, including through ratification of the second optional protocol. Thank you.
Norway welcomes Cuba's continued efforts to promote economic, social and cultural rights and its efforts to promote the social inclusion and rights of the LGBTI community. Norway recommends that Cuba quickly proceeds towards ratification of both the ICCPR and the ICE-SCR without reservations. Norway remains concerned about the lack of freedom of expression, assembly and association in Cuba. Norway recommends that Cuba develops and implements specific laws, policies and mechanisms that recognize and protect the work of civil society, human rights defenders and journalists. Norway has noted that Cuba has received several special procedures, and we recommend that Cuba issue a standing invitation to all special procedures, including those working in the field of civil and political rights. I thank you.
Slovakia appreciates efforts of Cuba to improve further its human rights legislative framework. At the same time, Slovakia is deeply disturbed by consistent reports on gross violations of fundamental freedoms and the right to participate in public and political life in the country. We are particularly concerned about detentions based on politically motivated charges. Allegations of violations of the rights to freedom of expression, assembly and peaceful associations are a matter of serious concern. In this context, we would recommend that Cuba, 1. Release all those who had been arrested on politically motivated charges, 2. Respect everyone's rights to freedom of expression and to peaceful assembly and associations, 3. Ratify the ICCPR and the ICE-SCR. In addition, Slovakia recommends that Cuba ratify the optional protocol to the CRC on a communications procedure. We wish Cuba a successful review. I thank you, Mr. President.
España saluda muy cordialmente a la delegación cubana y le agradece su participación en este ejercicio. De forma constructiva y respetuosa nos permitimos presentar las siguientes recomendaciones. Primero, que Cuba culmine el proceso de ratificación, entre ellos el del Pacto de Derechos Civiles y Políticos, el Pacto de Derechos Económicos, Sociales y Culturales, así como el protocolo facultativo a la Convención Internacional contra la Tortura. 2. Extender una invitación abierta y permanente a los titulares de los procedimientos especiales. 3. Establecer medidas que garanticen la libertad de asociación, la libertad de expresión y la de prensa. Y 4. Y finalmente, avanzar en la revisión del artículo 121 de su Constitución y a implementar medidas que aseguren la independencia e imparcialidad del Poder Judicial. Muchas gracias.
Mr. President, Sweden welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks for the report and the presentation. Sweden would like to recommend the government of Cuba to 1. Ratify the ICCPR and the ICE-SCR without restrictions. 2. Issue a standing invitation to the special procedures of the Human Rights Council, including all special rapporteurs. 3. Review legal provisions that restrict the rights of freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and bring them in line with Cuba's international human rights obligations. 4. Bring its electoral legislation in line with the international law and standards. I thank you, Mr. President.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma délégation souhaite la bienvenue à la délégation cubaine. La Suisse salue la visite à Cuba en 2017 de la rapporteure spéciale sur la traite des êtres humains et de l'experte indépendante sur les droits de l'homme et la solidarité internationale. La Suisse recommande à Cuba d'adresser une invitation permanente à toutes les procédures spéciales du Conseil des droits de l'homme. La Suisse constate avec satisfaction que les autorités cubaines se tiennent à un moratoire de fait concernant la peine de mort. Elle recommande à Cuba d'abolir la peine de mort pour tous les crimes. La Suisse recommande à Cuba de prendre les mesures nécessaires afin de garantir les droits à la liberté de réunion pacifique et d'association en conformité avec le droit international, en particulier les droits de l'homme.
The United States welcomes the Cuban delegation and has the following recommendations. 1. Reform its one-party system to allow for genuinely free and fair multi-party elections that provide citizens with real choices regarding their government. 2. Cease the practice of arbitrarily detaining journalists, opposition members, and human rights defenders, including preemptively, and adopt a legal framework that ensures judicial independence. 3. Release individuals who were arbitrarily detained and imprisoned for peaceful assembly, investigating and reporting on government activity, or expressing political dissent, and allow them to travel freely both domestically and internationally without limitation. The April presidential transition again robbed the Cuban people of any real choice in shaping their country's future. The Cuban government continues to criminalize independent civil society and severely restricts the freedoms of expression, association, religion, or belief, and the right of peaceful assembly.
Thank you, Mr. President. Australia recognises Cuba's progress on human rights, especially efforts to advance gender and LGBTI equality. However, we are concerned about ongoing reports of the harassment of human rights defenders. Australia recommends Cuba recognise human rights monitoring as a legitimate activity, provide legal status to local human rights groups, cease using tactics that intimidate them, and allow human rights defenders and civil society to engage with the UN and its mechanisms. Australia remains concerned by short-term arbitrary detention used to prevent independent political activity and freedom of assembly. Australia recommends Cuba end arbitrary detention of political activists and ratify the ICCPR and the ICESCR. Australia recommends Cuba formally abolish the death penalty. Finally, Australia recommends Cuba remove internet access restrictions and relax control of the broader media environment. Thank you.
Austria warmly welcomes the delegation of Cuba and the advancement made in the implementation of recommendations from the last review. We acknowledge that Cuba accepted for the first time in 10 years high-profile visits of UN special procedures. However, Austria is concerned about reports on repressive measures, intimidation and arbitrary detention of journalists and human rights defenders. We offer the following recommendations. Ratify ICCPR and the Rome Statute of the ICC, bring the framework on freedom of association and assembly in line with international law and standards, take measures to guarantee that internet access corresponds to international regulations that protect the right to seek, receive and disseminate information and ideas, promote human rights education on all levels, especially within law enforcement. I thank you.
La Belgique remercie Cuba, le Haut Commissariat et les acteurs de la société civile et recommande 1. D'abolir la peine de mort pour les crimes de droit commun en tant que première étape vers l'abolition complète de la peine de mort. 2. D'améliorer le climat de la liberté d'expression en prenant des mesures afin de développer des médias indépendants et pluralistes. Et 3. De reconnaître publiquement le rôle et le travail des membres de la société civile et prendre les mesures nécessaires pour garantir que les défenseurs des droits de l'homme et des membres d'organisations de la société civile puissent exercer leur droit à la liberté d'expression, de réunion et d'association pacifique conformément aux obligations internationales de Cuba. Je vous remercie.
Thanks Cuba for its presentation and recognizes the increase in internet access with over 600 public Wi-Fi hotspots. We urge continued developments without usage controls. Canada recommends that Cuba 1. Improve transparency and due process in the justice system by ensuring that arrested individuals are promptly informed of the reasons, have access to legal representation of their choosing, are afforded public hearings within a reasonable time frame, and are presumed innocent until proven guilty. 2. Adopt legislation providing legal status for NGOs and independent journalists. 3. Immediately eliminate harassment and intimidation of activists, including arbitrary short-term and pretrial detentions, as well as house arrest. Canada further urges Cuba to implement the ICESCR and the ICCPR.
Croatia welcomes the delegation of Cuba and thanks them for the presentation of their reports. We are pleased to see Cuba cooperating with independent human rights monitors in accepting the visits of a UN Special Rapporteur and a UN independent expert, and hope it will continue down this path. We are worried, however, that human rights defenders continue to be persecuted and prevented from traveling. We reiterate that civil society must be permitted to function freely and be allowed to cooperate with international human rights mechanisms. Allow us to address Cuba with 2 recommendations. 1. Remove legislative and practical obstacles for the functioning of civil society. 2. Ratify and implement the ICCPR and ICESCR. Croatia would like to compliment the government of Cuba for the progress achieved and wish them a successful review session. Thank you.
The Czech Republic welcomes the active participation of Cuba in the UPR process. We attach great importance to the active participation of all actors, including civil society, and thus regret that some representatives of human rights organizations were prevented from participating in the UPR pre-session as well as this UPR session. We hope that the outcome of this UPR will be widely published and followed by regular and inclusive consultations with civil society. We make the following recommendations. Firstly, to issue and implement a standing invitation to all special procedures. Secondly, to accede to the ICCPR and ICSCR and bring national legislation in compliance with these covenants, including by ensuring unhindered internet access. Thirdly, to implement legal safeguards protecting civil society and the media workers against abuse of provisions for criminal prosecution, including by repealing Articles 72, 73 and 74